The following program is made possible with support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation.
Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Heather Berlin.
And I'm Faith Saley. Science Goes to the Movies is all about movies, TV shows, pop culture, and science. Today, we are going to talk about mutants. This year's X-Men movie, X-Men Apocalypse, is the sequel to the prequel.
Directed by Bryan Singer with a screenplay by Simon Kinberg, the 2016 X-Men is all about the first and most powerful mutant called Apocalypse.
Ever since the world found out about mutants, there have been secret societies who see them as some kind of second coming or sign of God. They believe that tens of thousands of years ago, an ancient being was born, the world's first
mutant. You are all my children.
And you're lost because you follow blind leaders. But I am here now. I'm here for you.
We're delighted to be joined by Joseph Pickrell, PhD, core member, assistant investigator, and Hemali Phatnani, PhD, director of the Center for Genomics of Neurodegenerative Disease. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. So, what is a mutation?
Go ahead.
So a mutation is any change in the DNA, right? That is not common in the general population. So
Is there a number? Like, is it like has to be less than 2% of people have this?
1% or even less than a tenth of a percent counts as a mutation. But really it could be any variant away from any variant in the population could be considered a mutation.
Any variant?
Yeah, every variant started as a mutation. So at some point there's a genetic change that's passed on to one person, and then at some point maybe it's passed on to 2, 4, 8 people.
So that answers my pressing question. I was going to say, aren't we all mutants? And by all, I mean, you know, every person or animal or flower, it seems to be some sort of departure from early life, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
And even every different person. So everyone, if you compared my genome to your genome, there'd be a bunch of different differences that started as mutations that separate you from me and explain why your hair color is different than my hair color, or your.
Well, I can explain that, and I'll give you her number. She's great.
There are several characters in X-Men that have blue skin: Beast, Mystique, and her son Nightcrawler. And the new-to-movies character, Apocalypse. In real life, blue skin can be caused by overconsumption of colloidal silver, but in Kentucky, there was a whole town of people, the Blue Fugates, who all had genetically blue skin. So what causes this?
Yeah, so that's actually not a quote-unquote skin condition. It's actually a condition of the blood. So if you look at your skin, you have parts of where it looks blue because of your veins. And so the people in this family had a recessive disorder where their blood couldn't bind to oxygen as well. And so their skin all looked like your veins.
But they didn't all get it, right? So it's recessive.
It's recessive, so yeah, it depends on the exact combination of genes.
And did it affect their health negatively as
Not
a
at
family?
all.
Really?
Not at all. They all seemed totally fine, lived long lives. I mean, I think it scared a lot of their doctors.
And suitors, probably.
yeah.
I mean, did they go on to have
Yeah.
descendants who had blue skin, or did?
Well,
There
that's
they
a
are,
whole
yeah.
town full
But I
of
mean,
people with.
but there aren't any more, right? Unless you count the Smurfs.
Right, and so I guess what happened is this was a small town in a couple hundred years ago, and now, and so what you need in order to get this was 2 copies of the gene. So your mother had to have a copy, and your father had to have a copy. And now I guess as people start moving away, the chances of 2 people coming into contact like that is lower.
Does the fact that in our world today there's so much more mixing of genes from different races and backgrounds, does that create a hardier pool of mutations?
Well, it dilutes the effects of things like that. If they marry out, then the frequency of the mutation changes. And also, if you have too much of the kind of blood that doesn't carry oxygen so well, you might imagine that that would be bad for you.
In X-Men and the TV show Heroes, the genetic mutations cause supernatural powers, like naturally, it happens naturally. But there's a TV show called The Flash, and the genetic mutations that create this sort of race of metahumans results from an explosion in a particle accelerator. Mm-hmm. So in real life, how and why do mutations occur?
So you have, they're essentially changes in the chemicals in the DNA, right, which is a chemical. So any chemicals that alter the structure of these molecules would be mutagenic, cause mutations. The explosion in the power plant, you can have high energy particles. So the energy that is carried by these radioactive particles can be so high that that is enough to cause changes in DNA. UV can cause changes in DNA.
So what happens in the TV show The Flash could I mean, in a way, could really happen.
It would cause mutations, yeah.
That happened in Chernobyl, right?
Exactly.
And Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Well, any kind of radiation, especially to children, like so when I had to get radioactive iodine to treat my thyroid, and I couldn't be around any children or pregnant women because their cells are mutating so much more quickly, and the radiation could have more of an effect on these young children. Which leads me to the question of why are some mutations passed on to children and others not?
Yeah, it just depends on where a mutation happens in your body. And so in this case of the radiation in your thyroid, if there's a mutation that happens in your thyroid cells that causes it to reproduce a lot faster, that could cause cancer. But that's only in your thyroid. But if it happens in what we call the germline, so the cells that become eggs and sperm, then it can be passed on to the next generation, and that's the only difference.
So, but there are two. So it seems like there's two different, let's say, etiologies or causes of these mutations. One is it's just passed on through the germline. Another is that some environmental factor, like radiation, could come in and cause a mutation that can affect development or that can cause cancer.
Or there are intrinsic errors in replication of DNA. When DNA molecules make copies of themselves as cells divide, there could be errors introduced in this copying process.
But isn't it more likely then to happen earlier in life? Why is it that these mutations then, like cancer, happen later in life?
It's just more cells to hit. It's just a numbers game. If you imagine every cell has a probability of mutating of some low number, and you have 5 cells, then you're probably not going to have a mutation in those 5 cells. If you have 1 billion cells, it's just going to happen. So it's just a sheer numbers game. And so when you're older, when you're bigger, there's more cells to hit. And that's why if you live long enough, it's basically inevitable that you'll get some sort of cancer, because it's just, you're adding.
Unless you guys cure it.
Well, by that time.
By that time we will,
Yeah.
obviously.
In 2012, a group of scientists published a paper entitled A Programmable Dual RNA-Guided DNA Endonuclease in Adaptive Bacterial Immunity, describing how a bacterial system called CRISPR-Cas9 could be used to engineer genomes. The paper took off with extraordinary speed, and by early 2013, there were already several papers describing how the technique could be used to edit human stem cells. So does that mean we can now willfully alter the genetic code?
We can, absolutely. We can willfully alter particular genetic variants. And so there's some great experiments ongoing now in, for example, sickle cell disease, like I mentioned before, where you can take out somebody's blood cells, modify them, and then put them back in. And all of a sudden you've potentially cured this devastating disease.
I mean, it's a really good thing, I think, for these kind, like where you can, diseases where we know the genetic, where where it stems from, like Huntington's or sickle cell, and we can go in and modify the genome and cure these diseases. I think that there's a lot of controversy around it because going into modify, ultimately, once we get over, like, we can cure diseases, which is a great thing, the more we understand about the genome and how it relates to our brain and our minds, we can start using it for things like, creating super babies. Like, they're super intelligent, right. and that's where people are afraid.
I mean, so can we, are we at the point where we could create, something like a comic book hero that we see in X-Men?
Well, there's no gene for magic, right? So
right.
that would be tricky. But in terms of
breaking the laws of physics is always a bad thing.
Yeah, breaking the laws of physics is always impossible, but...
But super smart, super fast, super strong.
But we don't understand what you would possibly do to make somebody super smart.
Well, I think the only limiting factor is our understanding of the relationship. So people like at the Allen Brain Institute now, they're literally mapping out the genome and seeing how it corresponds to brain development. And if we can crack that code, then with this technique, we can go in and actually modify people and make them super smart or super...
And I guess the hang up there is less it's could we do this to ourselves? Could I choose to do that to myself, or would I choose for my children to do that to my children? And that's where it becomes very ethically tricky.
And so the question is, if we can do it, should we?
Well, I have to
And who decides?
Right.
So basically, just as a general thing, as we understand more about the genome and we can go in and suppress certain disorders from expressing themselves, the question is, should we? And, some people say, like deaf people, for example, say, that's part of who made me who I am. Like, it's not a bad thing, those who never experienced hearing, let's say. And so it's who's the one who's deciding what's a good mutation and what's bad?
Yeah.
Well, there's a kind of a sci-fi trope that, an excess of intelligence creates a deficit of empathy. Mm-hmm. And I will say, I played a genetically enhanced human on Star Trek. The character was Serena Douglas, and her parents made her have this operation. I'm turning towards you because you'll maybe understand this, where they enhanced her cerebral cortex to process information like super, super fast, but she couldn't get it in sync with her auditory and visual intake. And she was I. And so she ended up being kind of autistic until they did the surgery on her, and then she came out singing, I came out singing, and then the doctor fell in love with me, but I was so smart. I was so smart as a genetically enhanced mutant that I couldn't handle his love for me. Like there was a lack of connection between the emotional and the cognitive, and they had to send me off in a space pod to be a scientist somewhere. But again, well,
there's all sorts of problems. There's emotional intelligence and there's cognitive intelligence. But there's all sorts of knock-on effects that I think the X-Men doesn't get into as much. It's not like you just mutate something and then you get the superpower and there's nothing else bad happens. Like a lot of the time, mutations can give you something good, but also something not great, and we don't know what those knock-on effects are yet.
There's unintended consequences of all of these things, and if you think even people that exist today, so there are people who don't feel pain. For example, you have a genetic mutation that makes you unable to feel pain, which sounds great until you think about pain is actually pretty useful.
Yeah.
Next time you burn your hand on something and you move it, you'd be pretty happy that you actually feel pain, and they don't live very long. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just that we don't fully understand how genes act in combination, but there are also many different ways to get to the same trait. Like you were talking about this person who has trained himself to decrease his subjective experience of pain. But here you have a physical cause for why the person is unable to actually feel pain. So there's many different paths to the same trait.
Question for all of you. Do you think that science-based fantasy movies are having an effect on what we expect from science? And if so, is that good?
Yeah. No, I don't think it's good. I think absolutely it happens, and so you think, okay, we put a bunch of scientists on it, they sit at a computer, they tap away, and they come up with a solution. That's not the way it works. It's many, many people over decades and years putting together a body of knowledge that eventually can be used to help cure a disease or make some profound discovery.
Or put curiosity on Mars.
Yeah.
It took many, many years and many thousands of people working together to make that happen. And so when you have science portrayed in the movies and it captures people's imagination at what it's possible for science to do, that's a good thing. But when people think that all you need is 2 weeks at the bench and you suddenly cure disease, that's not entirely realistic.
Yeah, I think I agree with the idea that I think science and film and television inspires people. Mm-hmm. I mean, just even like seeing the flip phones or whatever in Star Trek. I mean, I think the developers actually were guided by that. Like, we want to make one of those, or Skype or something where we can see someone on a video screen. So almost they kind of inspire us, give us the ideas of where to move towards. And I know people, people aren't like, well, where's my flying car? It's not here already. I think people do get the idea of it does take time, but it gives us something to kind of aim for, at least plants the seeds, In X-Men, The Flash, and Heroes, mutants have magic powers. and most are feared and scorned by society. In Africa, men, women, and children with the genetic mutation that causes albinism have long been persecuted and viewed as less than human.
Outrageous violence has recently been inflicted on albino African children due to a newly circulated rumor that albino body parts have magic powers and can be useful in witchcraft practices.
Our next film is a documentary called The Boy from Geita, produced by Tina Pem and directed by Vic Sarin. The film tells the story of Adam, an albino Tanzanian boy, and Peter, a Canadian man with the same condition.
There's this notion in society that people with albinism are cursed things. They're not even people.
Amekuja baba akaenda kulala, na mimi nikamwambia tu baba, huyu hapa nimemuona na panga. Kaja tikaanza kunikata hilo limtu. Wale kwa baadaye tata zangu mdogo wangu hapa Adamu amekata mikono yote.
Tunakwenda wapi wa Tanzania? Tunafikia hatua hii. Kana nani sasa tulikuwa tumezoeana, akifa sasa nitakaaje mimi sasa tulikuwa tumezoeana tena.
We heard about Adam, and I sat down with him on his hospital bed. He says, well, all I want to do is go to school. He can't write. It's the kind of surgery he needs. We can't even contemplate doing it in Tanzania. And I'm thinking, how could I look at this little boy and just walk away?
So we associate this kind of thing with really ancient practices, but I think what's sort of the most disturbing thing about this movie is that this violence has only just begun about 15 years ago, based on this false belief. So we're talking about modern society. So why do you think in this day and age people still have these kinds of false beliefs, and how come, science hasn't sort of reached them in the way that we understand it?
It's probably a failure of education. It's sad that something like this could newly arise. And
it's sad and terrifying too.
It's horrific. It's horrific.
Does this kind of thing sort of scare you as we start to understand more about, mutations in the genome, that people might just have this visceral reaction? Because I think, science exists to kind of get around our biases. We tend to have these weird magical beliefs and magical thinking. I mean, even the whole herbal medicine industry, right, is this belief in like these things are going to cure me or they have magic powers with not a lot of evidence, but the evidence doesn't seem to matter. So, do you think it's scary that the more we understand, people still might not get on board?
It would be a failure on our part if we couldn't educate people enough on how science works and what constitutes proof, I think. But I don't think that we're ever going to be 100% successful. You can't tell people what to think or how to think. You can show them, but ultimately the choice is always going to be theirs. And if they're going to be led astray by people who tell them that, you're always going to have superstition.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're dealing by vocation. You guys chose to commit yourselves to this life researching genetics and mutations. So you're dealing with swaths of population who are considered sick or damaged or different, right? Mm-hmm. Depends on how someone looks at it. What do you, if you said it would be a failure on your part, meaning the scientific community, not to educate people, what do you two people want the world to know about genetics and mutations and what you do?
I mean, I think it's just key to realize that everybody is carrying a bunch of mutations all the time. We're all different. We all have these inherited differences from each other, and we just have to come to terms with that. There's no way to use that to sort of exclude people from society.
This boy, Adam, who's albino and lives in Tanzania, it is horrific to see his own father maim him in order to give some of his body for money to, the local witch. So let's be clear, first of all.
I mean, what causes albinism? Can we just explain to people?
These are mutations are in multiple different genes, mostly having to do with just pigments that your body makes and the different pathways that make the pigments. So it's just color.
I learned from watching this documentary that Tanzania has a sort of aberrantly high rate of albinism in Africa. Why would a certain country or community have that?
Yeah, I actually learned that from this documentary as well. But every community every population has their own specific set of genetic variants that are more common among them. So in Europe, cystic fibrosis is very common. In Ashkenazi Jewish populations, Tay-Sachs is very common. In different populations, different things are more common just from out of chance.
Gosh, even just seeing that picture, right? This situation is so heartbreaking. So can we just state for the whole world to know, including our very large audience in Tanzania, the genetic mutation that causes albinism does not also give magic powers?
Absolutely not.
Okay, what's happening in rural Africa is appalling and mind-boggling. But here in prosperous, educated America, there are also anti-scientific views, like the anti-vaccination philosophy, right? So, as scientists looking out on the general public, all you guys, what do you think of these decisions? Why do we as lay people, screw with your beautiful science?
Well, it's not just lay people, right? It's scientists themselves can sometimes be led astray.
Scientists are human, right? We're all human.
That's why we have
all
peer
have our
review.
biases and
that's why that science is a process, and that's why it takes time and many people. No one person does it alone. In the 60s, when people were looking at causes for autism, there were very legitimate therapies based on things that we consider absurd today.
But I think in general, I mean, we as humans, we have magical thinking. Our brains are set up to make meaningful connections between things. And so we do that all the time. It's just our innate experience. Science is there. I don't think we're sort of ruining the beautiful science. Science is there to counterbalance that. You're supposed to take away the subjectivity, and it gives you that objectivity. And people argue this about with different religious beliefs and stuff. I mean, people's belief systems are so they can become so hardwired that even the facts won't change them, because knowing something logically doesn't necessarily change how you feel about something. So even like climate change denier, it's 99% evidence that it's happening, but the people who don't believe in it will latch on to that 1%. So beliefs are very hard to change, and that's what I think science is constantly butting up against, the vaccine issue as well. If somebody has a fundamental belief that this vaccine causes the autism, no matter all the facts you throw at them, they might just hold on to that belief.
And most people now don't experience people with diphtheria and measles, and so you don't have this sense of the world fundamentally changed over the last 100 years with vaccines because you don't see it every day. And so without seeing it every day, it's sort of leaves you open to things.
I said to my friend who was afraid to get vaccines very recently, I said, you know what you should be afraid of? The diseases that they would get if you didn't have these vaccines. You should be fortunate that you live in a country that you have access to prevent these horrible diseases. So whatever fear you might have that the vaccines might cause, I'm telling you now that the actual having disease is way worse, so you should be thankful.
And the original study that prompted this whole vaccine scare was retracted, completely discredited, and then the guy made up all of the data.
Yet he was a scientist. That's your point, right?
Yep.
You mentioned autism, and maybe I'm so dense because you've sort of shed light on what a mutation means, but I just want to get this straight. So would autism be considered a mutation? Is anything that we call a disorder basically a mutation?
I'd consider a mutation any change in the DNA. And some of those are going to cause one thing, some of them might cause another thing. And so autism is probably caused by multiple changes in multiple different genes.
Instead of calling autism a disability, there's like saying it, they have abilities. They have different abilities.
Right. I don't mean to focus on autism. I'm just trying to understand. I'm trying to make sure I understand what a mutation is. So you can apply the word mutation to, well, you keep saying it. Any change.
Everything. I mean, it's just sort of your perspective. I mean, some, mostly men in the U.S., can't see particular colors. They're colorblind, right? Is that a mutation, or is that just a variant? Or I have blue eyes. Is that a mutation, or is that just something else?
I feel like the word mutation has gotten a bad rap.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think so?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. At its fundamental basis, mutation is change.
Change. Right. Why did you guys want to do what you're doing? What made you want to study genetics?
That's a great question. I'm just fundamentally interested in exactly that. What makes us all different? So why does some person have blue eyes and is predisposed to heart attacks, and another person has brown eyes and red hair and is predisposed to Alzheimer's? And if we understand that, then we sort of understand a lot of biology and a lot of like what makes us all unique and different.
And I'm just curious, and I like to understand how things work, including ourselves. And I like the scientific process, and I want to do something where what I do well can help people.
The stakes are really high. I mean, in particular, you're studying ALS. I mean, do you ever feel like a very weighty responsibility?
It's actually heartbreaking when you see these patients and you talk to them, because you know that the time it's going to take you to make any difference to them is going to be longer than most of the people who are donating their samples are going to be alive. It's
a time game. It's, can you make these discoveries in enough time to save the people? And I feel like we're at a precipice where we're tapping into the genome, and with CRISPR and things, we can actually change it. You know, if certain people with certain diseases can stay alive long enough, you know, maybe they can be there for the time we make the breakthrough.
It sounds like a movie. What you guys do is so exciting and so important. It's just a movie that takes a really long time to watch, right?
Yeah.
so science, that's what we were saying,
Yeah.
right? Science timescales are very, very long.
Could be 5 years, 50 years, 500 years. It's just so hard to predict these things.
It's almost like geology.
Yeah.
Well, that is about all that we have time for. We thank you so much for coming by.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks
you
a lot.
very
It's
much
been
for
a pleasure.
having us. It was fun.
Thank you.
Don't forget to check us out on the web at cuny.tv under the Science tab, where you'll find past shows, additional content, and a link to our app.